without further ado, introduce our panel, which I know are waiting anxiously to speak. General Meese, as Ed Fielder said, we're glad to have you with us. Please come up, sir. Also, Richard Allen was Ronald Reagan's chief foreign policy advisor from 1977 to 1980 and served as President Reagan's first national security advisor from 1981 to 1982. We have John Lehman with us as well, who served as the 65th Secretary of the Navy in the Reagan White House, and also Peter Robinson, who I can't wait to tell you more about, who spent 6 years in the White House from 1982 to 83, as well as chief speechwriter then to Vice President Bush, and later as to Ronald Reagan. And the rest of the story, I can't wait to tell. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you. Why President Reagan was able to manifest this consistency, why he, unlike much of the United States political establishment, did not turn towards detente of the 1970s. Mr. Meese, I'd like to start with you.
Well, Ronald Reagan had, prior to becoming president, literally spent a lifetime researching about communism. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 really was started, the road to that event started 40 years earlier, when Ronald Reagan was in Hollywood, and the Communist Party USA and their agents tried to take over the movie industry to use that medium for propaganda and to advance their cause. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild. He led the movie industry, the other unions, many of whom, the leaders of whom became his close friends throughout his life, and literally they defeated the communists in that takeover. That got him interested.
Mike Reagan told me that there was a period when Mike was staying at the house in Pacific Palisades, and whenever he would come home from high school, drop down his books, go in to say hello to his father was always seated at the big desk in the master bedroom where he would be reading and writing. It is always to be borne in mind that for a good 4 decades before he became president of the United States, Ronald Reagan had thought through the great issues of the day in the medium of his own pen and paper. All the way across this podium this morning, what you're hearing is, it was Ronald Reagan. I couldn't have written that speech, wouldn't have written the speech for anyone else. I had worked for Vice President Bush, a very fine man. But I can tell you, the first time you handed him a speech that was on foreign policy, he would look at you and say, now you cleared this with state, right? I would not have written that speech for George W. Bush, nor would any other figure have delivered it but Ronald Reagan. He was the one who made it all, who sent those carrier groups, who delivered that speech. It was Reagan.
Mr. Allen wanted to have one thing.
To drive the nail home on this, Peter, in 1978, I proposed to Governor Nancy that we go to Germany. We started in England, stopped in France, and go to Germany. He had never been to Germany in his life. By November 78, the trip was planned. I studied in Germany. Matt and I lived there. Our 2 of our 7 children were born there. One Munich girl is over here, my daughter Kristen, along with our other daughter Cass. She was a freelance journalist who was interested in peace, went to Iran and was nabbed and kept with them, but she wasn't released from the embassy hostages. In the meantime, Ed and I and others were negotiating on the release of Iranian assets, which ran to the billions. They had been sequestered, and part of the deal was that they would have these assets returned. The president said, the deal's off. I told him that there was a Cynthia Dwyer. He said, that's going to be difficult. He said, just let it be known that the deal could be off if we don't get Mrs. Dwyer back. So I let it be known that the deal might be off anonymously, and it got out a little bit in the press. The The next day, Cynthia Dwyer was taken to the airplane, but refused to get on until they returned her camera. They scurried to help the plane. Cynthia Dwyer got the camera, and off she went. Never heard of Cynthia Dwyer again. About 4 years later, I was on the McNeil, the News Hour with Robert McNeil and Jim Lehrer. And someone mentioned about Ronald Reagan not having any heart for human beings, individuals, any concern for them. And I told the story of Cynthia Dwyer. The next day in my office, which was about 3 blocks from the White House, got a call saying, "Dick, is that you?" And I said, "Yes." It's John Dwyer. John Dwyer from Notre Dame, the guy that had the room right next to mine at Green Phillips Hall on the 3rd floor. "Yes, John, that's my wife Cynthia you were talking about last night." "It is?" I'm a professor at SUNY, State University of New York, and she's been attacking Ronald Reagan ever since she's been back. So these years, she's still in the peace movement. And is that true? And I said, "Yes, it's true, of course." She said, "Oh my God, what's she going to do?" And I said, "Don't worry about it." So I called the White House, got the president to return my call and told him the story. He said, "Really?" I said, "What's her telephone number?" He didn't remember. About an hour later, I get a call. It's Cynthia Dwyer. "Dick Allen, we've never met, but oh my God, I picked up the phone, it was Ronald Reagan. Oh my God, what am I going to do now?" I said, "You have to do the right thing. Constancy of purpose. Get Cynthia Dwyer back." Of course, it was a major coincidence that she happened to be the wife of our next door neighbor, Green Phillips Hall on the 3rd floor in 1953 in South Bend, Indiana. That represented, among other things, a singular instance of constancy.
The Soviet military establishment was using 45 to 50% of the GDP. They were ascendant, they were confident, they were in power. And it wasn't until Ronald Reagan made the assumption that they were so vulnerable because they were, this huge military establishment was supported by a very weak economic underpinning. And that what we must do is demonstrate to them that this military power cannot stand against a united NATO military power, and that all this money has been a waste of resources. And that's what he did. And if it hadn't happened, the Cold War would not have ended, because they were succeeding. They were investing in a huge military establishment that was getting them real results. It had a president in Jimmy Carter who said, "We have to accommodate, we have malaise, we've got to reach a convergence." So it was succeeding. It wouldn't have crumbled. They weren't tottering. They were not tottering at all until Ronald Reagan came and implemented the basic strength of, that he knew was here. How do we apply this today? The fact is that we now have an administration that believes that diplomacy and why can't we all be friends is sufficient unto the case. That we are not exceptionalist. I mean, as the first president in our history doesn't believe that that the United States is different than the Treaty of Westphalia kind of nation states. And so he's pursuing a policy, this administration is pursuing a policy in dealing with Russia of appeasement. It's shameful and shocking, and none of us here can doubt that Ronald Reagan could not have possibly countenanced this throwing of the Iranian democracy demonstrators to the wolves by saying, as our president has said, "We don't interfere in domestic politics," except maybe in Honduras. But what we have to do is have constancy of purpose. Diplomacy, yes. Talk, yes. But successful diplomacy is the shadow cast by real military strength.
there is a resurgence of conservative values that he stood for. It is my generation that is coming to revitalize the GOP. What advice do you think Ronald Reagan would have for our generation and for the new conservatives that are coming?
Peter, don't take any crap. We can agree that the president would have winced slightly if that was
But he would have understood.
He would have understood. If it had been just in the old, if it had been just men, he would have, right, he wouldn't have used that language himself. I am just, this will not be a high level of analysis, this will be just emoting. But the notion that strong defenses, a sound dollar, limited government, some fundamental notion that human life is sacred and deserves special treatment in the law. The idea that that legacy of Ronald Reagan is in some way that it makes us all, and that Ronald Reagan, who won the Cold War, revived that somehow it's a failure, that we're all supposed to slink along through life feeling of it's nonsense. It is simply nonsense.
But I recognize what the most important reasons for success. We in the West had a strategy that we're able to sustain for almost half a century. The basic architecture is put in place and solidified is the fundamental power needed. And that architecture, particularly the NATO alliance, served us well throughout the Cold War. Let me first talk about a few ideas that underlie our success. The strategy of containment was set. The West undertook to resist any expansion of the Soviet Empire with the expectation that, sooner or later, the internal contradictions of the empire would cause it to look inward, and in the end, to change. As this went on, the guiding idea was shifted. The new idea was that and stood by this belief that Soviet Union would change. Because he said, and it's here down at Wall Street, in the West today, we seek a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity. We see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in human history. In the communist world, remember when he made a speech and he said, the Soviet Union is in the world empire. That was lawless enunciation. And one of my colleagues at the State Department, Paul Missy, served a long time, was testifying before a Senate committee. And they were denouncing this statement, finding one of them at the end said, how can we serve an administration to the president of the Soviet Union at the time? And so and Paul said, second, have you considered the possibility that the statement might be accurate?
The spirit of freedom that Ronald Reagan kindled in Eastern Europe, which we've heard so much about this morning and over lunch, was very visible then, and all the more poignant, the fact that Lithuanians got it on their own. But anyway, you haven't come to hear me talk. I've been covering Eastern Europe for more than 20 years now. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to know many of the people here personally from the days when they were still struggling for freedom. I remember Mark Lahr as a young MP in the Estonian Parliament discussing when independence would come. I remember talking to Mr. Balcerowicz about how possibly one day Poland might have a free market economy. And I remember perhaps most of all talking to Václav Klaus in mid-1989 about what we would do, or what he would do, if communism fell, when communism fell, and how the Czech Republic, which was Czech was in Czechoslovakia as it was then, which had been one of the most prosperous parts of Europe before the war, before communism, how quickly, how it just might, even in principle, regain its position at the heart of a new, united, post-communist Europe. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce not Dr. Václav Klaus of the Forecasting Institute, but President Klaus of the Czech Republic, one of the foremost states of the world. His own personal perspective on the unfinished legacy of the fallout of the war. Then we'll have contributions from the rest of the panel, again fairly brief, and then move into what I hope will be a very lively discussion. President Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this important event. We, in the countries of the former communist empire, we have many reasons to celebrate the end of communism, and this month of November, is the month we do it in different countries of Central and Eastern Europe. But we are convinced that this is an event, the fall of communism is an event which deserves to be celebrated, and I'm convinced not only by us who are victims of the regime. So thank you for organizing this event. That's my point number one. Point number two, it seems to me that it should not be the commemoration of the past only. You speak about the unfinished legacy. I don't think that communism will come again. Communism is dead. Communism is definitely over. But I feel other collectivist, dirigistic isms which are around, and to say that our victory is a final victory would be a tragic mistake, and that's another reason for it is so important to organize such meeting like this one. Third, I always say that communism at the end of the 1980s was already weak, soft, old, without any meaning to anyone.
Of yours from those days when the war was coming down, and whether you see any signposts then in the future that we may have missed.
Well, yes, I'll happily do so. Last Monday, I had dinner with Margaret Thatcher. I told her I was coming here. She was very envious of that. And I said, "Do you have any advice for me?" And she said, "Charles, be firm." The only response I could give was in the words of that famous television series, "Yes, Prime Minister." But I think Margaret Thatcher was absolutely convinced that the wall came down for two reasons. One was the utter firmness and consistency of purpose of President Reagan and his determination to put intolerable pressure on the Soviet system so that he created the conditions under which the wall would come down and communism would collapse. And secondly, she credited it to some very, very brave people in Eastern Europe, many of them with us on this platform and in this audience today, who themselves were prepared. Talking to her since then, I think I would just make 5 points about what lessons that she would have drawn from those days. The first is that we were too quick to declare victory, to believe that we had won a final battle for freedom in 1989-90. That was not, of course, the case. As we see now, there are many countries in the former Soviet Empire which either don't have freedom or are threatened, or the freedom is threatened from within or from outside, as in the case of Georgia. And when we look back, as we all do in Britain, to President Reagan's great speech in London in 1982, when he set out the agenda for freedom, we realize we've actually still got a long way to go before that freedom is fully recognized. Secondly, we've lost the clarity of purpose that characterized President Reagan's administration. You know, people talk about him oversimplifying. But I absolutely agree this morning with what was said by Peter, that the problem wasn't oversimplifying, the problem is overcomplicating, because that leads to delay, inaction, and indecision. I have this memory of President Reagan, his final NATO summit in 1988, when he was due to make his closing remarks. And one of his ever-helpful staff advanced and handed him a little pile of cards with the suggested points to make and so on. And he took it politely, turned it upside down, and then delivered from the depths of his soul the best 10-minute exposition of the purposes and meaning of NATO that I ever heard in all the years I was working with Margaret Thatcher. Then, thirdly, this need for clarity, I think, is particularly necessary in our continuing relations with Russia. Bending before Russian belligerence is never the way to deal with that country. You would have thought we would have learned that from history. So when we duck, instead of opening a path for countries like Georgia and Ukraine eventually to join NATO when they meet the conditions, we are simply giving way to unjustified Russian pressure. And when we pull out or decide not to deploy the missile defenses in Poland and the Czech Republic because the Russians don't like it for perfectly spurious reasons, then I'm afraid we are simply bending to Russian pressure, and that is a very bad thing. I think we've lost a lot of the transatlantic solidarity which was so important during the Cold War. Now, people accuse President George W. Bush of making the United States unpopular. But you know, I think the Europeans have had their share of the blame for the state of the transatlantic alliance. There seems to be a sense in Europe that we don't have to make an effort, that we can have a risk-free existence, that we can have a sort of easy internationalism without actually making hard choices and spending money on defense. I'm afraid until we can get rid of that, the original sense of transatlantic unity will be lost, and that will weaken us going forward. And maybe lastly, the lesson I would draw would be President Reagan warned us of demonstrated to us the existential danger from nuclear weapons. But he also showed us a positive way to counter that danger through the Strategic Defence Initiative. One of my great regrets, and I know it's Lady Thatcher's too, is the impetus behind that great programme has been lost, but we should have actually been maintaining it, developing it, because we do have the technology and it can be made to work. So, I fear that we are forgetting the lessons which enabled us to win the Cold War and to see the fall of the Berlin Wall. And can I just add, finally, one little story. In his remarkable speech at lunch, Secretary Shultz mentioned that Margaret Thatcher disagreed with President Reagan. This is very rare, on the subject of the United States invasion of Grenada. Well, that's not actually quite true. She wasn't against it, but she was very unhappy that President Reagan forgot to tell her before he decided to invade part of the Queen's dominions. But to make it worse, he did it on the very day of the week that she had her weekly audience with Her Majesty the Queen. And when the Queen said to Mrs. Thatcher, "I hope President Reagan didn't tell you he was going to invade my dominions," she had to say, "Well, no, I'm afraid he forgot." That was the only reason for her concern. Thank you.
Well, one unfinished legacy of 1989, which Dory referred to, Ronald Reagan's picture hangs in offices in Georgia. The unfinished legacy, it doesn't hang in the White House. Because Ronald Reagan, I think, is becoming increasingly recognized as one of the great men, not of American history, but indeed of world history. What he did in the early 1980s, reviving the American economy, which was to a lesser extent imitated in other parts of the then free world, which started a global boom. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the extraordinary expansion of economic and political liberalization throughout the world gave us something absolutely unique. Never before in history, as we saw between the early 1980s and the summer of 2007 when the financial crisis hit, never before in history had so many people in so many parts of the world advanced so quickly economically as happened in that quarter of a century. And one of the most amazing things is, while we focus on India and China, Central and Eastern Europe, thanks to Matt Barr and others, that region as a whole grew faster than the Asian region as a whole. So it was an extraordinary advance, and Ronald Reagan his legacy was responsible for it. And what happened in 2007 shows what Jefferson talked about: liberty requires eternal vigilance. Look what has happened. Ronald Reagan understood that when government makes mistakes, it blames others. The private sector is being blamed for this economic crisis. Actually, it was the Federal Reserve's easy money, Fannie and Freddie, which Ronald Reagan would have been appalled by the monster size of huge regulatory mistakes, and it's a boring subject, things like mark-to-market, which devastated the financial system earlier this year. But all of that, consequences, those consequences are blamed on the private sector. So today, the statists are having a brief period of a comeback. We need the spirit of Ronald Reagan, who understood free people create prosperity, not government bureaucracy. Of recent years. He killed the great inflation of the 1970s. He also understood the importance of free trade, which unfortunately this administration so far is the first since Herbert Hoover who doesn't recognize the United States must take a forceful lead in reducing trade barriers. If we don't do it, the world will have ultimately a redescent to the purgatory of the 1930s, where more and more countries feel they're on their own, and that'll have enormous, devastating political consequences. So Ronald Reagan understood the basic principles of economic progress, whether it was the rule of law, sound money, low tax rates, which enable people to have the opportunity to take risks, create businesses, innovations, which enable us all to move ahead. He understood that free enterprise was not a zero-sum game, and he understood that free enterprise has a moral foundation. It's not greed, it's not the lust, it is serving the needs and wants of other people. It's not zero-sum. We all advance when entrepreneurs and innovators have a chance to create new things that enable us all to move ahead. So it's always an unfinished legacy. It's always an unfinished legacy. But by going back to what Ronald Reagan understood and taking heart that he understood life is not a straight line, that you have to learn how to maneuver, but never losing sight of the ultimate goals. You can achieve the ultimate goals. And I just remember how utterly inconceivable it was, especially after Hungary in 1956, the idea of rolling back the Iron Curtain is seen as just a relic of the early 1950s. Ronald Reagan was the first Cold War president to understand we could win the Cold War. And that's what we celebrate today. That's the spirit we should approach our economic problems. He understood free enterprise, free people, free markets. That'll get us out of these difficulties, as he got us out of our difficulties in the early 80s, when we faced a severe financial and economic crisis.
First, on the one hand, you have the empirical question, whether the Helsinki process was helping us that era or not. That's definitely an empirical issue which can be discussed, documented, and I would say that I had not felt any improvement in my life, in the life of the whole Czechoslovakia at that moment. So that's an empirical debate. It's not dreaming about the role of international agreements and institutions. That's the reality. I had a big trouble in the bank where I was working, and I had a big dispute with the director of the bank, and I said, Mr. Director, well, do you follow the Helsinki process? It was a direct question, and he started to laugh because it was absolutely irrelevant for him. So I have many doubts. Use the term rule of law and to discuss it in a yes and no terminology. Have you introduced it or have you not introduced it? The rule of law can be introduced as a delivery. You can build for 5 years this beautiful residential library, and then you say this is the D-Day, and here are the keys of this library. I'm afraid that some of the European and American, not only politicians, but the politologists and analysts think about the rule of law in the same way as of opening this library. This is not the way. We have been permanently in our countries discussing whether we should have better legislation first or letting the markets and all other social interactions to develop, and it's really impossible. I know some highbrow advices from the West coming to us at the beginning of the 1990s. You must have rule of law first. I was always telling them, what do we now? The people have no democracy, we liberalized many things, and people tell them, wait a minute, we would for 3 years try to create the rule of law. In the meantime, you may go on vacations or something, and the social development, economic, political development would put to a standstill, and then we will start. So the famous chicken-egg equation, we were not privileged to start with the eggs, or with the hen and eggs, you say.
Chicken and eggs.
Chicken and eggs.
And I think
Well, we had to work on chickens and eggs continuously, parallelly. So a prioristically to expect to introduce, to deliver the rule of law, I'm sorry, it's not the way how it can be done.
Yes, I think the communists had done probably eaten all the eggs and killed all the chickens.
Well, we're here at the Reagan Library. What's the name of this event, Larry?
This is the Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Wall. Reflections from yesterday, lessons for today.
And it's for commemorating November 6th. And it was actually the speech that they gave on June the 12th, 1987. Fall of the Wall came in November what?
November 9th, 20 years ago this year.
Yeah, or November
This
6th.
week.
Or was it 9th?
9th and 10th, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Anyway, there were a lot of luminaries here today. Lots. Ed Meese and Steve Forbes. And who else was here? Name some of them.
The one that impressed me the most was Admiral Lehman, who talked about the 600 Fleet Navy and the problem he had. And the big thing is, where people say things about Ronald Reagan, when he came into power, our entire military was really in mothballs.
Yeah.
And we had to rebuild.
I wanted to mention that fact that this is kind of an off the record mention that he mentioned that after the bombing of our guys in Lebanon, the 241 Marines that lost their lives in that suicide bomber.
Yes.
Yeah, there were contingency plans for revenge, to get even with these people. He hit the top levels of the Hezbollah that created this, and then it was held back.
The bureaucrats shut it down.
Yeah, bureaucrats where? Someone
in Washington,
in the
D.C.
State Department, somewhere in the Department of Defense. Who knows who those people were?
Well, we could talk about it now because it's been declassified.
Exactly. They had two Ajax missiles or something, Tomahawk missiles, scheduled for arrival at the local Hezbollah headquarters, and too bad that didn't happen. At any rate, listen, the main thing that I was concerned about was they didn't talk about, they were talking about, the reason for the fall. It seems like they didn't mention the key ingredients of that. One of the key ingredients of the reason for the fall was because of what they call perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika meaning a reform from the Russian side, and glasnost meaning openness. So what happened is the Russians wanted to do trade with us. So what they did is they tried to trade with us. The people that made, which Aeroflot makes, and what are the airplanes? Who makes the airplanes for the Russians? You know?
I'm not sure. Not sure. You know,
well, anyway, those guys all wanted to come over and join up with Boeing and try to trade and because they had the best aircraft design, but they were lacking in the technology for the engines and the flight equipment. And anyway, it's the bottom line is that we never supported them when they needed it. When Clinton got in, he just let it. He didn't trade with them, and that killed them. And they had to raise their taxes, and that was the end of that.
You know, when we reflect back on Reagan, he came in office 1 year apart from Margaret Thatcher, and they were both very strong anti-communist. And Lord Charles Powell, who was her private secretary, really had the inside track of what it was that was where she first served as the bridge between Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan.
In fact, she met Gorbachev before Reagan did, and she set the stage. She said, "This is a man I can deal with," and then she gave her Aphrodite to Reagan, and then Reagan picked up on it and said, "Well, if you can deal with Thatcher, you can deal with us."
Very true.
The issues at hand, though, I mean, it was too bad we couldn't interview some of these people that were here. Ed Meese, particularly, I wanted to see him, and Admiral Lehman, of course, was
they both wanted to be interviewed, but they got whisked away.
Yeah, they got whisked away. They were being sequestered. Steve Forbes, all of them, the variety of them have their different issues at hand, but there were some great people. Who was the other guy that I wanted to bring up was Richard Allen, who was a policy advisor under the Nixon administration, and then he came in and did the first 2 years of the Reagan administration, and then they promptly booted him out of there.
He was National Security Advisor between 81 and 82.
He's obviously a super moderate, where Lehman is a super patriot, Republican,
I won't
conservative.
repeat some of the things he said.
No,
but
he
he
was
really
awesome.
lit my fire.
He was telling the straight scoop, and it was really good.